Chapter 1. The Beginning. As the moon shone brightly in the clear night sky, you could visualize all the stars and constellations there were to see. Young Frank Massey, who was born and raised in Dothan, Alabama, was just getting back in from deer hunting. Bringing in a 9-pointer buck, Frank decided to skin and clean him before it became too late. Nailing the heavy animal to a tree upside down, he cut into the soft skin of his stomach as guts went everywhere. Waiting for him inside the house was his wife of 6 months, Jessica. She loved to hunt as well, but stayed behind on this trip to do a little housework. By the time he was done, so was dinner, but he had to go straight to the bathroom. After a hot shower, Frank and Jessica sat at the kitchen table, having chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, vegetables, and hot homemade butter biscuits. Grabbing the remote control off the counter, Frank changed the channel to the FOX News Network to catch up on the current events. Although he had voted for Donald Trump and was one of his biggest supporters, he was disappointed in the actions of his current president. And news segment 4 came on. The anchor was speaking on a tweet that the president made about Kim, aka the Little Rocket Man, the president of North Korea. "He's going to get all of us killed while he's flying high in his jet," Frank said to his wife. "That's your president. You voted for him." "I told you he was a joke from the start," Jessica responded. "I tell you what, Jessica, if that son of bitch don't get us all wiped off the map, he'll get impeached before the year's out," Frank stated, in his deep country accent. Finishing their food, Frank put the dishes in the sink, claiming he would wash them up in the morning. Feeling freaky, Frank and Jessica wrestled on the living room couch before taking their horny selves into the bedroom. Meanwhile, in New York City, Gino, a young black man in his early 20s, was strolling down Jamaica Avenue in with his lady Val. It wasn't snowing, but it was brick, as New Yorkers say. Val stayed snuggled in Gino's arms, finding heat the best way she knew how as they went store to store. Being it was getting late, the couple wrapped up their shopping as they loaded back into the vehicle to go to their Brooklyn apartment. Gino and Val weren't married, but they had a child together. The little boy, whose name is Justin, was 4 years old. Having their ups and downs as any other couple would have, Gino never cheated on Val. She was his heart and soul. He wanted very much for his son to grow up with his daddy in the household. Once they were home, Val had to take her mother back to her place because she was babysitting for them while they were out. Gino decided to cut Justin's hair while he waited for Val to return. "Well, there goes the snow," Val said, as she and her mother exited the apartment. When Justin went to the window to look out, the snow was coming down hard. He was excited, being he was only 4 years old. Finding his favorite cartoon, Justin sat in the chair like a big boy as his father gave him a mohawk. Being it was the weekend, neither Gino nor Val had to work the next day. And most importantly, Justin didn't have to go to school, so he wanted to stay up late. Val came in about 45 minutes later with a few grocery bags in her hands. Telling his lady to order a pizza because he didn't want to cook, Gino called Justin out of the room so his mother could see his haircut. She suggested that he try to get his barber license, being he was so sharp with the clippers. Everything was going well, and since she decided not to go back to school, Gino wouldn't have to rush home to get Justin. He admitted that he would take it into consideration just before Val sent Justin to his room to get ready for bed. Having a seat on the sofa, Gino kicked his feet up as he strolled through the channels of his television. "Baby, you know my mother wants to take a cruise to the Bahamas this spring. Is that something you might be interested in?" Val asked Gino. "I don't know about that. You know how your mom gets with me sometimes. She's the funniest acting person I know. But who knows? We'll see." Not finding anything on basic cable to watch, Gino turned on the Fire Stick in order to watch a good movie. Val made sure Justin was in his bed, even though he was playing his video game. As she made her way down the hallway back to the front room, Val grabbed a snack from the kitchen before cuddling up with Gino for the evening. Chapter 2. The first wave. After a great weekend in Dothan, Alabama, that following Monday afternoon, Frank and Jessica were out on the town getting some things to take back to their 20-acre farm. Frank had workers cropping and selling corn by the tons to local businesses. As they headed back to their pickup truck, Jessica noticed her cellular wasn't working. Thinking her battery was dead, she implied she needed to charge up her phone in the car. At the same time that Frank and Jessica attempted to enter the truck, did they hear tires screeching at the traffic light? A car had run through the intersection, slamming head-on into another vehicle. "Oh my goodness, did you see that, Frank?" Jess asked as she rose out of the car to look. Running to the aid of the crash victims, Frank, Jessica, and numerous other bystanders ran to the vehicles in an attempt to check the victims. Once on the scene, Jess began to hear everyone complaining about their cell phones are not working. And as they looked around, all the traffic lights were off, as well as the lights in all the stores. The people in the automobiles were jammed inside and had to be removed by ambulance, but there wasn't a way to call, because out of 100 people standing around in the streets and stores, nobody's cell phones had bars. Realizing it wasn't much they could do, Frank and Jessica went back to the truck. When Frank turned the ignition to crank up, nothing happened, as if his battery was dead. And when they exited the car and took a good look around to see if any other vehicles would crank, it was the strangest thing either of them had seen. Figuring they could walk the 3 miles it was to their house, they put one foot in front of the other and made it home in about 45 minutes. Along the way, they saw plenty of other people walking as well. There was some type of power outage going on in the city, and nobody had an answer for anything. When they arrived at the head of their driveway, Frank, who was carrying a bag of seeds in his hand, saw that the power to their place was off as well. There was a street light that always burned at the corner of the lot, and it was off. "What in the shit is going on, Frank?" asked Jessica as she walked into their house. "I don't know, baby, but this shit is starting to spook me out." 9. Frank walked through his place to find that nothing in his house worked. Even a new digital watch Jessica had just bought for him was lying on the dresser and had stopped working. Their closest neighbor was about a half a mile up the road, so Frank had no idea what they were going through at their place. At the same time, they were trying to figure out what was transpiring over 1,000 miles away. In Brooklyn, New York, a school bus plowed its way through the intersection of a traffic light, striking multiple cars, ultimately hitting a light pole and catching on fire. The driver was unconscious, and the kids were scattered amongst the seats, badly injured as the smoke poured out the busted windows. Just as it happened in Alabama, everything stopped at an instant. The brave bystanders managed to pull 5 of the kids from the bus before it erupted in a huge ball of flames. Out of the 5 kids who were severely injured, one of them laid lifeless as one of the women on the scene tried to breathe life back into his little innocent body. It was little Justin, Gino and Val's son, coming back from a field trip with the school. Both of his parents were at work and were experiencing difficulties of their own. Gino, who worked in a factory, was standing amongst hundreds of co-workers, wondering when the power would come back on. Nobody in the building's cell phone was working as Gino attempted to reach Val. The shift supervisors informed everyone that the power would be back on momentarily, but they had no clue about the phones. Gino had a seat at his desk while conversing with a few of his co-workers. Meanwhile, on the other side of Brooklyn, Val was working at an elderly rehab and assisted living facility when the power suddenly shut off in the building. Normally, they would have a backup generator to kick in, but for some reason, it wasn't working either. Things immediately became chaotic when the nurses realized their cellular phones weren't working. No one could call the EMS for the people who needed oxygen. The building instantly started cooling down, reaching unbearable temperatures in no time. One of the CNAs found a box of flashlights in the hallway closet and passed them out to the other nurses. Val, along with a few more ladies, went room to room trying to comfort each resident as much as they could, considering the situation. When Val walked into room 145, she noticed the man wasn't moving as she came close to his bed. "Mr. Jones, it's Val. We're making sure everyone is okay," she said as she shook him by the shoulder. She didn't get a response at all, as she then realized he was dead. Tammy, Mr. Jones is dead," she yelled in the hallway. The other nurses rushed into the room to see that he had passed away. Things were deteriorating fast as Val could hear another nurse yelling from down the hall in need of assistance. The doors had even stopped working, leaving Val and her co-workers locked inside for hours and hours. While Val was attempting to take care of as many people as she could at the nursing home, a 747 jet had dropped out of the sky in Harlem, crashing into multiple buildings. There was a sense of panic in the streets as the traffic became congested due to the lights not working. Everyone thought it was another terrorist attack when the huge plane fell out of the sky. Dark black smoke filled the air as scared people ran in terror, wondering why their phones weren't working and why the fire department hadn't shown up yet. Every car that was on the road had stalled, except for a few older 80s model vehicle. Every traffic light in the city had stopped working. It was madness from avenue to avenue. Chapter 3. Terror. Although they didn't know each other at all and were thousands of miles apart, Gino and Frank had something in common. They, along with the rest of the country, were powerless. Nobody had a clue to what was going on, and with no power, they couldn't watch the news or use their cellular phones. What no one person knew was that North Korea had shot an EMP warhead on a ballistic missile into space. Once the rocket exploded, detonating the EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, it would destroy all our satellites in outer space. No one could see the explosion because it would be too far away. The electromagnetic waves fried every electrical component in the United States. Anything that worked on a computer wouldn't work at all. Transformers on the power lines burned out instantly across the land. Planes fell out of the skies from state to state. The sewer system was shut down and nobody had running water in their houses. Every single thing from your watch, vehicle, phones, and all electronics was disabled. Not to mention every bank shut down immediately, losing every single dime in their records. If only there were one television in each state that worked, then the word would spread through the grapevine to what was going on. But that would be a dream. We had prepared our homeland defenses for so many years to be able to shoot down any missile coming toward the United States soil, but we never prepared for something simple and so devastating. So many millions of people had died across the country in the first hour of the blackout. Nobody knew it, but there was no law and no military protection on the U.S. soil. With no way to communicate from base to base, the soldiers were just trained men with guns. While Frank and Jessica was in Dothan, Alabama, searching through their barn house for a gas-powered generator they had purchased last winter, Gino and Val in Brooklyn, New York, had each ended up walking home from work. Thousands of people were strolling through the streets, doing the exact same thing in the large metropolitan city. Millions of people had to commute across bridges all around the United States. Millions upon millions had to locate their kids by walking to the schoolhouse or figuring out where the bus went dead at. It was a total disaster in the making. It was like when Puerto Rico lost power after the hurricane, but 100 times worse in the first 6 hours. Women couldn't locate their children. Millions of elderly and critically sick people died, especially the patients who were on any type of life support machines. The Navy soldiers who were working in submarines underwater all perished in the ocean they patrolled. Construction workers using gigantic cranes to move multi-ton pieces of steel crashed into buildings, sending glass, sharp metal, and debris storming down everywhere. All pacemakers stopped working in every single person's heart with one installed. Chaos and riots had instantly broken out in Los Angeles, Miami, Houston, Atlanta, D.C., Baltimore, Myrtle Beach, and all of New York. The looting of the stores began the moment everyone realized there were no police to respond. People didn't even have the power to use the things they were stealing, but they figured the electricity would be back on soon. In just 4 hours, 25% of the United States population had been eradicated. With no one to recover dead bodies, nor an ambulance in sight, the stench of death was on every American corner. And although no one knew what was going on, it was becoming clearer by the minute that everyone had to fend for themselves. Anybody who had a vehicle from the early 80s back was good. Their cars still operated as normal, but there was no place to get gas from. People stole fuel from other cars that were broken down on the side of the street, as well as out of their front yards. But when they got the fuel, where would they go? Nobody had an answer for anything, as the entire country went under martial law. Chapter 4. Alabama. Down in Alabama, Frank and Jessica managed to get their solar-powered generator up and running before the sun went down. It had enough juice to power the house for a few hours, being that they had it put up in the shed. Jessica had already rounded up all their guns and ammo, especially after hearing so many gunshots off in the distance. "Baby, I don't know what the hell is going on, but we need to stay close to the house until we figure out," Frank said. It was dark on the property, and in an attempt to save energy, Frank only burned the lights in one room of the house. Although none of their appliances worked, Jessica pulled the charcoal grill out on the back deck and put a few stakes on it. Being the farmer he was, Frank had a water pump in his backyard that allowed him and his wife have plenty of water to drink throughout the night. "We must have had some type of electrical surge that burned out all the components," Jessica stated as she and Frank stood by the grill. The hunting dogs out behind the shed began to bark as they smelled the aroma of the beef in the air. Claiming that he would walk to town bright and early in the morning, Frank held Jessica close, gazing into the night sky as they conversed about any and everything. While Frank was having his romantic moment in the blackout, there was a group of guys at his closest neighbor's place attempting to break inside. Less than a mile up the road, 3 young men had kicked the door down and taken the neighbors hostage. Holding the rather older man and his young wife at gunpoint, one of the intruders dared the couple to move off the floor. The house was pitch dark inside as the other 2 guys ransacked the place, looking for money and guns. "I found it, yo! I got it!" one of the dudes yelled out from the back room. When he came back up front, he was carrying a small safe. The old man claimed there was nothing in it, as one of the robbers tried beating him with a pistol to get the combination. Finally, taking all he could take, the old man gave up the numbers to open the safe. There were 30,000 in large bills stacked neatly inside, along with a few small handguns. "You have what you want. Please leave us alone," the old man stated as blood dripped from his mouth. "Fuck this old man Eddie, he doesn't have shit else in here to take. Let's hit the next house down the street," one of the men said aloud. That's when Eddie directed his attention to the young lady who was lying on the floor, terrified. Grabbing a handful of hair, he pulled the short, thick black girl up to her feet. That's when Eddie ripped her shirt off like it was made of tissue and began sexually assaulting the lady. Unable to fight off the men, she lay helplessly on the couch as each of the robbers had their time in her. When they were done, all 3 men left the house, getting into their '76 Cutlass. Speeding down the road heading toward the farm, the savage group turned their headlights off as they got close to the property. Turning into the yard and down the driveway, Eddie put the vehicle in park as all 3 men exited the car. Walking slowly toward the front porch, Eddie halted in his tracks. "What business do you boys have here?" Frank yelled from behind the barn. It was so dark Eddie could barely see his hands when he held his arm out. So he definitely couldn't see Frank is taking cover behind the barn with his rifle. "I'm not looking for trouble. My friend is wounded and needs help," Eddie blurted, as he clutched his pistol behind his back. "Again, I'm going to ask you, what business do you have here?" Frank asked as he stared down the night vision scope on his hunting rifle. Eddie had one of his boys to walk along the side of the house in an attempt to surround the voice that spoke out to them. That's when Frank fired thunder from his rifle, sending a hot piece of metal at the guy walking near his house. The bullet hit him in the chest, exiting out his back and into the outside wall of the house. Eddie started shooting into the darkness, as did his homeboy, but their aim was way off. Looking down his scope, Frank was ready to take another shot. Realizing they were in a losing situation, Eddie and his homie got back in the car and left the property. "Jesse, baby, you okay?" Frank asked. "Yeah, but we got a dead one on the side of the house," Jessica stated as she stooped down on the other side of the barn. "You think he's still living?" she continued. "Hell no, I hit him flush in the heart with a supersonic round. I do believe he's a goner, baby." Frank slowly made his way to the young white man as he lay curled up on the ground. Getting help from Jessica, they dragged the heavy dead body to the back of the property. Frank insisted he would bury him tomorrow when the sun came up, as he and Jesse went back inside their house. Meanwhile, Eddie and his boy were 15 minutes away from the farm when the car ran out of gas. They had made it back to the city, but were out of place when they exited the vehicle. "What y'all white boys doing over here in this part of town?" a middle-aged black man blurted out of a large group of guys. Attempting to run away from the crowd back up the street, Eddie and his partner were chased down and beaten up. Taking the keys out of his ignition, one of the guys from the hood searched the car, finding the 30 grand he took from the old man. Ultimately, making Eddie run up the road, beat up, battered, and naked, he disappeared into the night. Chapter 5. New York. The next morning was a sad day for Gino and Val up in Brooklyn, New York. Gino had walked to the school the day before to find out Justin had killed in a bus accident. Val didn't sleep all night as Gino sat up in the dark, holding her in his arms. By the time the sun came up, Gino went to look out of his apartment window, was amazed at what he saw. People were crowded all through the streets, along with the trash that was dropped as looters opened up the packages they stole from the stores. They didn't have any running water, and only had a gallon of artesian water in the refrigerator. Unable to cook anything, Gino grabbed some sandwich meat and cheese out the fridge. Making a couple of sandwiches for he and Val, the emotionally crushed dad caressed his lady while thinking about their son, who they buried last night in the backyard of the apartment. See, when Gino went to the school yesterday, he was greeted with the bad news. With no way to call the ambulance and so much chaos on the streets, some good pedestrians carried Justin's dead body to the school. He was laid inside the principal office when his dad arrived. Broken and empty, Gino carried his son in his arms all the way back home. He walked past looters, people being robbed in broad daylight, and even the banks were destroyed inside out. But none of that fazed Gino as he walked in shock and disbelief. When he made it home, Val fell to her knees in tears as she held her dead and hard-body baby boy tightly. Finding a shovel, Gino buried him in the back courtyard as Val looked on in the darkness. New York was out of control. There wasn't a police in sight, and the street gangs had taken over the inner-city neighborhoods. All the shelves were empty in just about every store in the entire city. Even Walmart had been ransacked in the first night. All the gun stores had been broken into and cleaned out from top to bottom. Men who were normally dressed in police uniforms were home with their families trying to figure out what was the next move. Fires were burning out of control, leaving thousands of people in the streets with nowhere to go. Women and babies were prey for rapists and child molesters that paraded through the madness. Back at Gino and Val, things were quiet until the couple heard someone knocking on the door. "Maybe that's someone to tell us when the power will be back on," said Val as she got up off the couch to open the door. "Who is it?" she asked as she stood on the other side. Then suddenly the knocking stopped while the person at the front door remained silent. Back away from the door, baby. Forget about them, Gino stated as he rose up from the couch as well. That's when the doorknob starts to shake as the person on the other side tries to get in. Val ran into the back room to hide while Gino stood at the front door holding his baseball bat in his hand. The knob wiggled again as Gino clutched the handle of the bat even tighter. Taking a deep breath, he anxiously waited as he knew the time was near. The door flew open as the rather heavy-set, bald-head black man rushed inside. But to his surprise, he ran head-on into the wrong end of Gino Bat. Falling to his backside, the intruder's fingers stretched out as his muscles locked up. He wasn't knocked out but badly stunned when Gino went Barry Bonds on his jawbone, knocking teeth everywhere. Seeing the 200-pound man lying there shaking on the floor, Gino dragged him out into the hallway and down the stairs, where he threw the man down to the next floor. Hurrying back to the apartment, he went straight to the bedroom in search of his lady. "We need to leave here soon, baby. Things are getting too crazy. I have some family down south in Alabama. If only I had a car to drive and enough gas to make it there," Gino stated. Neither of them had a living family in New York, so the only place Gino knew to go was back to his mom's house in Dothan, Alabama. But that was easier said than done, being he had to find a car that was working properly and enough gas to make it 17 hours away. Insisting that he had to go down in the streets in order to find a vehicle, Gino told Val to be ready to leave everything behind when he returned. Demanding Val to stay in the bedroom until he returned, Gino told her not to open the already broken door for anyone as he left the apartment heading downstairs. When he exited his building, there was a group of guys who looked to be a blood gang standing at the entrance of the courtyard. Knowing he wouldn't make it past them without being harassed, Gino went around the side and jumped a fence. So many people were out in the streets and around their buildings that it looked like it was a Brooklyn Queens Day Festival times 3. Gino made his way through the crowd as the crowd seemed to never end. But as he reached the corner of Nostrand Avenue, Gino saw an old Jamaican man and his wife coming out of their building with a few bags in their hands. They were walking to a 77 Nova that was parked on the side of the street as Gino conscious started getting the best of him. He wanted to rob the man for his car that apparently was drivable, but he didn't want to take it from those particular people. Asking the Lord for forgiveness, Gino ran up on the couple from behind, acting as if he had a gun. The woman immediately dropped her bags and started running back toward the building. Handing Gino the car keys, the Jamaican man pleaded for his life before being told to run off as well. Jumping inside the Nova and cranking up, Gino spun off as he was one of a few cars driving the streets. He knew a cut he could park the vehicle in while he ran up to get Val out of the apartment, so that's what he did that. Trying his best to dodge danger on his way back to the building, Gino was stopped by a little boy about 7 years old. "Do you have anything to eat?" he asked Gino. The boy said he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He continued saying he didn't know where his mother was, as Gino stood there motionless. Unable to help the boy, Gino continued through the courtyard, coming up from the back of the courtyard to their building. He had to pass by the fresh grave of his son to get to the back doors. His heart fluttered as he made it to the lobby. The building smelled like piss and shit as Gino went up the stairs to get to his door. Knowing it was broken already, he walked inside calling for his Val. No one answered as he looked in the closet. She wasn't in there, so Gino began to panic as he turned to go check the rest of the place. When he got to the kitchen, which was near the back of the apartment, is when he saw Val lying on her stomach on the cold floor. Her pants were down, and blood was still leaking from her head. She was raped and killed just that fast. Gino fell down to the floor beside his lady as tears dropped from his face into the blood that Val had laid in. Having $500 cash stashed in his bedroom air conditioning vent, Gino grabbed the money as he exited his apartment, feeling a rage and fire that couldn't be diminished. When he arrived back at the Nova, he left it parked in the cut. There was a guy across the street trying to get Gino's attention. Acting as if he didn't hear the man, Gino got inside the car and cranked up. The guy across the street darted off in the direction of Gino and the Nova. Stomping the gas in the nick of time, he was able to pull off as the man grabbed the side of the window with a death grip. Dragging the desperate man down the road as he floored the gas pedal, Gino swung the curb, sending him flying away from the car. The old Jamaican man, Gino, took the Nova was leaving town, and the car had a full tank of gas. With no traffic lights and no law officers to stop him, Gino made his way to the highway, crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, bypassing Staten Island, and onto Interstate 95 South. Chapter 6. The Reaction. America was burning down from the inside out, and what nobody knew was that the United States Navy and the Air Force had retaliated against North Korea from Japan by dropping multiple nuclear bombs from some high-tech U.S. bombers. It was an all-out war, but not a soul on American soil had any idea what was transpiring outside the homeland. After being without any source of power for 2 days, people began to get desperate and cross the border into Canada. They were still connected to an electric grid that wasn't destroyed by the EMP. And soon as the northern Maine and northern Washington state residents realized their problems would be solved if they crossed over into Canada, did the Canadian military posts are setting up blockades in attempts to keep people out. Not only did Canada have electricity, but Mexico as well. And just like the U.S. Border Patrol tried for so many years to keep illegal immigrants out of America, did the Mexican government had to patrol that same wall from the other side. Most people couldn't endure what the Mexican desert had to offer, so only the truly desperate took a chance. To make a long story short, there were dead, decaying bodies for miles and miles throughout the desert. In the Midwest areas like Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, and Oklahoma, the residents were more reliant on the land than the people of the South. But unlike the southern states, the people of the Midwest had to endure more frigid temperatures. Once the word got back to the northern half of the United States, residents who bordered the Canadian line, that their neighbor had electricity flowing like water, it was like the shopping stores on Black Friday. The Canadian president initiated a state of emergency for his entire country. Americans poured across, finding refuge wherever they could. The crime rate soared through the sky within 3 days of the United States being knocked off the power grid. People came with their guns, drugs, and whatever cash they managed to keep safe from the thieves into BC, Canada, overpopulating the city within hours. The Canadian president ordered his military to detain any Americans they captured and bring them to a holding camp reserved for foreigners in Western Canada. One of the closer allies of the U.S., the Canadian government agreed to help as much as possible without causing conflict in their states. The city of Toronto was riddled by residents from Detroit, Buffalo, and Albany, New York, before they could get prepared for what the government described on the News 33 as a wave of disaster from their southern neighbors. Quebec was instantly bombarded with crime and violence, as folks that hadn't eaten in days were in search of any type of civilization beyond the United States. Down in South Carolina, the scene appeared to be 10 times worse than when Hurricane Hugo hit in 1989. Except for this time, there was no government assistance to help people get back on their feet. While true God-fearing people prayed to the Lord for deliverance, the country quickly became a melting pot. Chapter 7. Interstate 95. Meanwhile, Gino was doing everything the Black Nova had as he crossed the Virginia state line. Looking at his gas gauge, he noticed that he would need to refuel soon. There were cars all along the highway that had been left by their owners days before. Gino had to come up with a quick plan, and he had to do it fast. Seeing the Richmond sign on the overpass, tired and hungry, he exited off the highway en route to the gas station. Knowing there was no way for him to pump fuel, Gino was hoping there was some type of vehicle he could funnel some gas out of near the station. And his intuition was right. because as he came over the bridge to where he could see the store, he also visualized a few vehicles in the parking lot. Spirits high as a 747 jet, Gino slowly turned onto the abandoned station property, pulling to the front of the store. All the windows had been broken, and it was obvious that it had already been looted and destroyed on the inside. Carefully looking at his surroundings before entering through one of the busted windows, Gino made his way inside in an attempt to find any type of hose. Strolling down the empty aisles, he was out of luck as he decided to walk around the backside of the building. That's when he saw a water hose tangled up in 31, what looked to be the storage closet. Taking his knife from his pants pocket, Gino cut the hose, making it just long enough to reach from one car to the other. Taking a screwdriver he found in the back seat of the Nova, Gino popped open the gas caps on all the vehicles as he siphoned all the fuel he needed. By the time he reached the third car, the Nova was full to the limit. Throwing the hose in the truck in case he needed it again, Gino hopped inside his car and attempted to crank up. Soon as he turned the key in the ignition, he was surprised from the outside of the vehicle. Grabbing him through the window of the Nova was a crazed, desperate, and strong man who watched him fill up his automobile with fuel before making his move. He had his arms wrapped around Gino's head as he struggled to pull him out the window. Managing to get the car out of gear as he was being pulled out of the driver's side, Gino stomped the gas. Being he had one hand on the steering wheel when the car darted off, it immediately crashed into the trash dumpster that was near the side of the store. The guy still had a tight grip on Gino, but was forced to release as the jolt from the car hitting the trash can knocked him away from the vehicle. Startled but filled with adrenaline, Gino exited the Nova before rushing over to where the man was attempting to get up from the ground. Kicking him back to his stomach, Gino, who had more strength, commenced to beating the brakes off of the would-be robber. With no one there to stop the fight, Gino continued beating the man until he was unconscious. Blood flew from his mouth as he was kicked in the face one last time before Gino ran back to the Nova. When throwing the car into reverse, he spotted a group of people wearing black masks coming in his direction through the rearview mirror. Quickly shifting the Nova into drive, he stomped the gas once again, but this time nothing was stopping him from getting back on the highway. As he reached speeds well over 80 miles per hour, Gino continued south on 95, while hundreds of starved people walked along the wood line in both directions. Although there were a few older model cars on the interstate as well, nobody made eye contact as their vehicle passed by the Nova. Keeping his head forward, Gino also made his way deep into the south hour by hour. Chapter 8. Miami, Florida. While Gino was tearing down the highway hoping to make it to South Carolina before gassing up again, Don Westbrook was in Dade County, Miami, Florida, trying to find a way out of the city. He needed to head north into Jacksonville where his parents lived. Unable to reach them since the blackout, Don was truly worried that someone would try to hurt the elderly couple. Considering how chaos and violence had overshadowed the Liberty City streets he walked through, Don knew it had to be rough for his parents in northern Florida. The power had been off 2 days now, and it was survival of the fittest in the city. Don hadn't even spoken a word to his girlfriend and her 2 sons who reside on South Beach. With no running water, some people were forced to drink raw sewage from the ditches, while others took their chances getting buckets of water from swimming pools. Some Floridians took refuge near lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams, hoping to have access to fresh water. The weather was excellent for that time of the year, so that's one thing Miami had going for itself. Standing in his bedroom peeping out of the window blinds, Don had to make a decision. Should he go straight to his parents' house when he finds a ride, or leave his house in search of his girlfriend and her boys? Strapped with 2 9mm Glocks he purchased a few months back, Don sat on the side of his bed as he weighed his options. His girlfriend of 2 years, Sonia, had 2 sons, 17 and 20. The love Don had for Sonia would ultimately lead him to one decision: which was to get a car, go to South Beach to get his lady, and stepsons then head up to Jacksonville. Being he was in Florida, it wasn't going to be hard for Don to find an old school car. Taking it was the hard part. Unlike New York, where nearly 95% of the residents had no way of transportation, cars were up and down the Miami streets. Not to mention Don heard automatic gunfire all night as he attempted to sleep. It sounded like a war zone and seemed as if the people shooting had an unlimited amount of ammunition. Although he wasn't a street dude and worked hard on his 9 to 5 every day before the EMP attack, Don was 48 hours into the Stone Age. He was ready to do any and everything to make it out to his loved ones. Seeing every vehicle that passed by his house loaded no less than 4 deep, he knew it would have to be a night mission. With a little more than $100 cash on him, Don was like any other American with money in the bank. Broke. As the moon peaked high in the sky, it was time to make a move. Grabbing a backpack full of microwavable dinners and a few bottles of water, Don made his way out the back door. Luckily, his yard was fenced in by a 6-foot wood gate because he was able to look at the scene before entering dangerous territory. And sure enough, when he peeped over the fence into his neighbor's yard, he saw something he didn't like. It was a group of black guys, all with guns visible in their hands. But what made the situation creepy was that 2 old Hispanic ladies lived in the house. Going to the opposite side of the fence, Don exited out of his front yard into the darkness of the street. Keeping his right hand close to his hip as he walked down the street, hoping to catch someone slipping, Don made his way through the hood like a roach, trying not to get stomped in your house. He was going to his homeboy cousin's place because he knew the guy had a '67 Chevy and it wasn't too far up the block. All he had to do was catch him walking to the vehicle and take his keys. Nobody in Miami had a clue to what was going on or that the rest of the country was suffering just as they were. When Don arrived at the backyard of his homeboy cousin's crib, he immediately saw what he was in search of. The Chevy that normally had 28s on it was sitting in the yard with the factory tires on it instead. Pulling his mask down over his face, Don clenched his 9mm tightly as he waited impatiently in the bushes for someone to exit the house. After waiting almost an hour, the time finally came when the back door of the house opened up. Don ducked down into the shadows as a tall, heavy-set black guy came out and started walking toward the car. Surprisingly, it was his homeboy Ryan instead of his cousin. Fuck, Don said quietly as he prepared to come out of the dark. Running up from the blind side, Don put the gun to the back of Ryan's skull. "Don't move, man. All I want is the keys," Don stated as the gun trembled in his hand. "You're gonna have to kill my nigga. I ain't giving up shit," Ryan blurted out. "Please, man, don't make me do this. All I want is the car so I can leave." "Yo, Don, what the fuck you doing, man?" Ryan said as he recognized his voice. "I just need the keys, my nigga," Don uttered, before Ryan turned around quickly and rushed in his direction. As 280 pounds of solid weight came charging at Don, he pulled the trigger. Ryan went down from a gunshot to the upper shoulder. Knowing it was a matter of seconds before someone else came out of the house, Don quickly grabbed the keys off the ground and ran toward the car. As soon as he cranked the big block engine up, the back door opened once again. It was Ryan's cousin Todd, and it was his car that Don was inside. Shifting the old school into gear, he punched the gas, not knowing how much power the vehicle had under the hood. Unable to control the Chevy as the RPMs kicked in, Don knocked down the neighbor's fence when the rear end fishtailed back and forth. As soon as he turned out of the driveway onto the road, the shots started ringing off. Ducking down in the seat as he pressed the gas as hard as he could, Don had the wheels of the '67 Chevy screeching as he turned the corner, leaving out of sight. When he made the short trip to South Beach, where Sonia lived, it was mayhem in progress. The entire strip had been looted and destroyed. People were hanging in the streets, drinking liquor, smoking weed, and flashing guns. Don wasn't stopping for anyone until he reached his girlfriend's crib. It appeared as if the hood had taken over the entire city. Once he turned into his lady's driveway, Don hopped out of the vehicle, running to the front porch. Knocking on the door, he waited for his love to answer, but there was no response. He continued to beat the door faster and harder, as he needed Sonia to come on so the four of them could leave. Seeing he wasn't getting anywhere by knocking, Don slipped his credit card out of his wallet, sliding it through by the knob area, making his way inside. "Sonia, where y'all at? Let's roll, baby. We're going to Jacksonville," Don yelled out as he roamed through the place. The house was so quiet you could hear a pin drop, but his lady was nowhere to be found. Her purse was on the bed, as was a suitcase half filled with clothes. Her son's room appeared to be untouched and normal. "Sonia," he yelled one last time before hurrying back out the door. Driving a little over the normal speed limit, Don made his way to Interstate 95 North and proceeded to Jacksonville. Chapter 9. Camden, New Jersey. The next morning in South Jersey, Shane Williams was awakened by the sound of someone attempting to break into his home. "Baby, wake up. They're trying to get inside here now," Shane said to his wife, Olivia, who was still sleeping. Then suddenly the door came crashing in. Already out of the bed, Shane rushed over to his pistol that was on top of the dresser. The screams of a scared woman echoed through the house as Olivia jumped out of the bed herself to get behind Shane. Standing in his room, holding his .357 Magnum tightly as he pointed it at the closed bedroom door, Shane could hear several people talking as they made their way through the house. Taking aim with his large-caliber snub-nosed revolver, Shane braced himself as his bedroom door gradually began to open. Wait. I'm unarmed, and I have my family with me," the short, bald black man said when he saw Shane pointing his gun at him. "What the fuck are you doing in my house?" "I was trying to move my family to a safer location when we were spotted by some people that wanted trouble," the man answered. "So you come to my house to get all of us killed?" asked Shane as he lowered his weapon. "Luckily, my wife and son can run just as fast as me because we were able to escape without them seeing where we went. I'm Ricky, and this is my wife, Stacy, and that's my son, RJ." Explaining that he was trying to make it to Philly where his closest relatives lived, Ricky suggested that he and Olivia comes along with them. Although Philadelphia was a short distance away from the Ferry Avenue to South 8th Street, nobody had a vehicle, so it was going to take 5 heads to come up with a witty plan of escape. With no clean water to take a bath or drink in days, things were really starting to get a little drastic. Stating he was planning to go grocery shopping right before the blackout hit, Ricky said that he hadn't eaten a real meal in almost 3 days. And the bad part about it was that Shane didn't have anything to offer because everything was raw in his freezer, going bad by the day. With no way to cook anything, Shane and Olivia was forced to eat all the snacks that were in their cabinets, along with the few perishable canned items they had. With nothing to drink or eat, they had no other choice but to leave the apartment in search of answers. Stepping into the hallway, carefully making their way toward the staircase, Shane and Ricky led the pack. Numerous people on their floor had their doors open as hungry kids ran up and down the hallway begging for food. They had to step over a dead body that was lying on the floor in the fetal position near the top of the stairs. The stench of death reeked through the stairway as both families cautiously made their way down to the lobby. Chaos would be an understatement for what fell upon their eyes. Passing by a group of guys smoking weed and drinking a big bottle of liquor, Ricky noticed a group of junkies shooting heroin in the arms. But the bad part was that one of the ladies had their little boy right beside her as she got high. "Where are you headed, my man?" A rather young man who looked to be in his early 20s asked Shane as they attempted to exit the building. "We're going south, brother, to a relative's house. We can't survive in Camden with this nonsense, and nobody seems to know what is going on," Shane responded. "Be careful, man. It's crazy out there," the man answered back before walking away, going back inside the building. When they stepped out on the street, Shane suggested they walk down the block towards the bridge to enter Philadelphia. Without any trains, buses, or cars, the highways were flooded with people, all seeking answers from anyone willing to explain. After walking for miles, Shane kept his hand close to his .357 Magnum as they approached the bridge to cross the river. "Where the hell is the police?" Ricky asked Shane as they continued to walk. "I don't know, man. This shit is mind-boggling." "Forget the police. We need the army out here," Stacy blurted as they approached a group of men that seemed to be controlling the area. Carrying a small machine gun, one of the guys began to come in their direction. Sliding his hand closer to his pistol on his waist, Shane cautiously walked ahead of the group to approach the armed man. Surprisingly to advantage, the guy was with a group of vigilant peacemakers that had banded together to help secure their community until power was back on. To his liking, Shane and the crew were escorted across the bridge by two armed young men. While making their way to Philly, one of the young men warned Shane and Ricky not to go across the river until the power was back working. Insisting that they had no other choice, Ricky and Shane ignored the words of wisdom from the young man as they came down the bridge. The armed guys went back towards Camden as Shane, Ricky, RJ, Olivia, and Stacy entered what they were told was no man's land. Just as chaotic as it was in New Jersey, Philly had no shortage of crime. Thugs roamed the streets, looting stores. Fires were burning from building to building as they made their way down the avenue. The smell of gunpowder seeped into their nostrils, along with the black smoke from the burning building. Ricky knew he had to make it to West Philadelphia, where his uncle and cousins lived, before things got any worse. But without a moment's notice, Shane was tackled from behind by a short, stubby guy wearing a red bandana on his head. They hit the ground with so much force, the wind was knocked out of Shane as the weight of the man fell on his back. As soon as Ricky attempted to help, he was held at gunpoint by another guy who approached from the rear. They were getting robbed of everything they had on them. While Ricky, RJ, Olivia, and Stacy lay face down on the pavement, the guy got off Shane and stood back to his feet. At the same time, Shane caught a second wind as he lay on his stomach. Reaching for the .357 on his hip, Shane pulled it from his waist as he rolled over to his backside. The guy holding the Calico assault rifle spotted the gun in Shane's hands and fired 3 shots in his direction, hitting him in the chest twice. "See what you made me do? I was going to let you go, but you boy fucked it up for all of you," the man said as he continued to point his weapon at Shane. As his body twitched on the ground, the man fired another shot in his head before riddling everyone in the group body with bullets. "Yo, look, he is a strong one," the short guy said, pointing at RJ, trying to get up off the pavement with a bullet wound in his back and neck. And at that very second, the armed man fired another shot at RJ, hitting him in the head. His body hit the ground as blood poured from his cranium. Running off behind the city buildings, the guys left 5 lifeless bodies in the middle of the street. Chapter 10. South Carolina. It had been a week since the power grid was destroyed. Word had gotten around that the entire country was under some type of cyber attack. While a majority of Northerners were in distress, Mike Todd and his family were prepared for an apocalyptic situation like this. Living on a 10-acre farm, Mike had an underground bunker built in his backyard with a year's supply of food and over 200 gallons of drinking water in it. He had solar-powered generators and plenty of ammunition for the weapons he possessed. He even had gas stored away in an old tank behind the horse stable. His wife Mildred and 2 daughters, April and Gail, were preparing dinner when they heard gunshots at the far end of their property. "Did you hear that, Ma?" April asked as she grabbed a plate from the cabinet to put 4 well-done steaks on. "Yes. Where is your papa at?" Mildred asked, referring to her husband Mike, which the kids called Papa. "I don't know. He was out in the pasture the last time I saw him," Gail responded. Peeping out of the mini blinds in the kitchen window, Mildred didn't see Mike anywhere in the yard. Hearing the gunshots so close to their property, she began to worry that there may be trouble on the land. Stepping out on the front porch, she tried calling her husband's name, hoping he would answer out. But there was a moment of silence before Mildred's ears were once again rattled by the sound of more gunshots deep down in the woods, which was about 10 acres of tall, healthy pine trees and shrubs. Quickly stepping back into the house, she told the girls that it may be time to execute the plan. Grabbing the shotgun off the table, Mildred had April get the rather heavy box of ammunition and follow her to the bunker outside. The Todd family had drills several times a year to prepare themselves for the worst. The ladies knew they were to go to the bunker and wait for a special knock from their husband and dad. And for the past few days, Mike was on high alert because he knew with the power down, things were bound to get dangerous on the farm. He had 2 old pickup trucks, so he had transportation, being they didn't possess any computer chips in them. But the one time he did go out to the town to see what was going on, Mike was astounded by what he saw. People had broken into every store in sight. The little country town in South Carolina he was used to was in an uproar. When he returned to the farm, Mike never went back out as he had everything he needed on his land. So while the ladies were closing the door of the bunker, locking themselves inside, Mike was on the west end of the property, stooped down behind a broken pine tree, while taking fire from a group of 3 men. "We don't want any problems. Hold your fire," one of the guys yelled over to Mike. "When you stepped foot on my property without my permission, you became a problem. You need to leave now before one of you get killed." Hiding behind a sand mound about 50 yards away, one of the guys spoke back out to Mike. "We are putting our guns down. We come in peace." Coming out into the open where Mike could see him clearly, the man held his hands up in the air to prove he was unarmed. Walking towards the farmer, he begged not to be shot as he was harmless. Much bigger than Mike, the muscular man who stood about 6'5" moved slowly while getting closer to the end of the barrel of Mike's gun. "That's close enough. Now turn around and keep your hands up." Searching him from behind, he realized the man was unarmed as he said. Allowing him to relax, Mike had him call his boys out of the woods before lowering his weapon. With all of the men in front of him with their weapons lowered, one of the guys blurted, "My name is Andy, and these are my cousins Rod and Matt." While extending his hand out, offering his friendship, Andy was pushed to the side as Matt, the shorter of the 3, grabbed the rifle away from Mike. Knocking him back off his feet, Matt immediately pointed the high-powered hunting weapon at him and dared him to move. Mike pleaded with Matt, but he wasn't hearing anything that he said. Andy even attempted to take the gun back from Matt while telling him he was tripping, but he was unsuccessful. "Get up off that ground, old man. Let's go back to your house. I know you have some more guns and food there. Hurry up and get your ass off that ground like I said," Matt said while aiming at his head. Slowly making his way to his feet, Mike walked back toward the farm. "Who's there waiting for you to come back?" Matt asked as he pushed the gun in Mike's back. "I'm alone. There is nobody at the house but me," Mike answered. "Okay, if I find out you're lying, I'm going to shoot you first." As they came onto the farm grounds, Mike helplessly walked closer to the house, hoping his wife would be looking out of the window. But when he walked on the porch and opened the door to walk into his place, it was empty. The ladies were gone, so it appeared as if Mike was alone, like he said. Seeing this, the clever farmer knew the girls must have heard the shots and went into survival protocol. While he was being held at gunpoint in the kitchen, Rod ransacked the house trying to scavenge anything he could. Andy was going along with Matt's plan, but he really wanted peace, and Mike could tell he didn't want to abide by Matt's rule. And after seeing women's clothes in the back rooms, Rod knew someone else lived here as well. "He lied. He has a wife and 2 daughters," Rod said as he walked out of the back room holding a picture of the 4. Matt, grinding his teeth, pointed his handgun at Mike's head, demanded to know where the ladies were at. But he couldn't give up the location of the woman he loved the most in life, so Matt slapped him across the face with the pistol. Blood shot from his mouth, being the hard steel knocked a few of his teeth out. "Come on, man, he said was alone. Let's get what we can get and go," Andy spoke aloud. But instead of leaving, Matt made Mike walk out the back door to see what else he had to offer on the farm. When they got in the back by the horse stable, Matt noticed they had generators running near 2 doors on the ground, leading to an underground cellar. "What's down there, old man?" Matt asked. "Nothing. Nothing at all," Mike responded. "Well, let's see. Because you already lied about being alone," said Matt. Andy went over to the wooden doors, reaching down in an attempt to open them up. But they were locked shut from the inside. He tried to yank them open, but there was no budge. "Unlock the doors, old man, or you will die out here in this yard today," Matt screamed as he aimed his .44 Magnum at Mike's head. Meanwhile, Mildred, April, and Gail could hear the men talking to Mike on outside of the bunker. They knew something had to be wrong because Mike didn't give the special knock. Holding a Winchester pump shotgun tightly in her arms, Mildred insisted the girls go back deeper into the bunker. She waited patiently behind the wooden doors, pointing the long barrel gun at the entrance, waiting to shoot the first person to come inside. Her finger trembled as it stroked the trigger slowly. As Matt became increasingly angry, he slapped Mike again, knocked him unconscious. Grabbing an old axe that was lying near the house, Matt started swinging at the wooden handles, trying to break the door open. And after 4 swings, the locks were broken, leaving access to the inside of the dark bunker. Looking at Mike stretched out on the ground, Matt ordered Rod to finish him off. "Come on, man, the old man doesn't have to die," Andy said. Walking over to the old farmer as he lay in the fetal position, Rod pointed his 9mm at his head and fired twice. Mildred heard the shots on the outside of the bunker as the doors slowly began to open. Backing up in the shadows, holding her shotgun firm, Mildred's heart was beating 1,000,000 beats a minute. Matt swung the door open and attempted to go down the stairs. Soon as he reached the bottom, Mildred fired buckshots from the Winchester, which opened up his chest like a split watermelon. The force of the blast, damn near, sent him back up the stairs as he fell back forward, rolling down to the floor. Rod immediately ran to the doors to enter the bunker when he heard the shot. Seeing his cousin bleeding profusely at the bottom of the stairs, he didn't hesitate to go to his aid. But as soon as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw Mildred out of the corner of his eye, which grabbed his attention. The moment he looked up and realized he was on the bad end of Mildred's barrel, it was too late. The flash from the shell exploding is all he saw before buckshots ripped his face off. The girls were terrified as their mother was eliminating the problem one by one. Andy broke off running back in the house, grabbing the keys for one of the trucks out in the front yard. He never looked back as he cranked the old Chevy up and left the property, slinging dirt and sand everywhere. Mildred carefully made her way to the outside of the bunker, where she saw her husband shot to death on the ground. Mildred fell to her knees, grabbing hold to Mike's shirt as she cried her heart out. 1 month after the blackout. Chapter 11. Washington, D.C. The streets were dark, but far from quiet. You could smell death and decaying bodies throughout the entire city. Every store in sight had been vandalized, not to mention the White House torched as well. If anyone heard or knew someone who had an ample supply of food or water, they would take it. What started off as a regular power outage, a month later has the entire country living in the Stone Age. People who were in the elevators of the buildings when the power went out are still on the elevators, dead. All the people who were on cruise boats are still floating in the ocean, leaving hundreds of ships full of dead people. Down on Pennsylvania Avenue in the city of D.C., a group of about 10 people had managed to survive through the times of hardships by banding together and being vigilant. Word was starting to spread that there was plenty of food and clean water down south in Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. The leader of the crew was a street-savvy gangster disciple member named Rollo Black. He had lost his entire family, wife, and 3 kids when someone attempted to rob their house in the first week of the blackout. Ever since that day, Rollo was on a mission to help his fellow DC residents make ends meet day by day. Using an old school bus as transportation, Rollo had a few of his guys to get as much gas from the cars that sat in people's yard broke down, being they had computer chips in them. They had a substantial amount of pistols and machine guns to issue out amongst the crew. Although he had never been past Virginia, Rollo was ready to take a chance in the dirty South. So ready he had the designated driver to fill the bus up with gas before putting the big yellow machine on I-95. With 10 5-gallon jugs full of gas covered by plastic trash bags to keep fumes down, the crew from DC headed down to South Carolina, where they heard people were living off the land. Informing his driver not to stop for anyone or anything, Rollo sat in the seat behind him, holding a small Uzi in his lap. Glancing back over his shoulder, Rollo could very well see that his crew was ready to do anything and everything they had to do to survive. And, being they were going into unfamiliar territory, Rollo knew there was a great chance many of them might be killed. After an 8-hour ride, the bus was crossing the South Carolina border, and Rollo were wide awake, gripping his weapon firmly. Taking directions from one of the crew members who took numerous trips down south in the past, named Tariq, Rollo anxiously sat in his seat as they made their way to Horry County, which was on the northeastern coast of South Carolina. When they were passing through Marion County, the bus started to overheat as steam came out from under the hood. The guy driving the bus had to pull over on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. It was pitch dark, and Rollo couldn't even see 5 feet in front of him. It was so quiet he could hear animals making noises in the woods from miles away. "Man, fuck this country shit. I'm getting back on the bus," one of the younger guys from DC named Fred said. Fred was a cocaine dealer who sold hundreds of kilos on and near Independence Avenue. Although most of his crew died within the second week of the blackout, there were a few who managed to slip through the cracks of death. Fred's right-hand man, Kyle, was head of the security for the new crew. He was a light-skinned, slim, long dreadlock, 18-year-old killer for hire before the blackout. But when shit hit the fan, Kyle found himself in the dark all alone. With survival looking grim, he decided to link up with Fred, who stayed in the same building as he did. Rollo had met Fred and Kyle while sobbing over the death of his family in the lobby of their building. On the brink of taking his own life, Rollo took the time to listen to the much younger Kyle and Fred, who themselves were alone in the streets. The 3 vowed to watch each other back no matter what. Picking up a few strong hands along the way, Rollo took control of the 10-man team when he provided them a way out of the city. Now they were deep south stranded in the boondocks. But little did Rollo, Kyle, Fred, or anyone on the bus know that they were being watched. Not just watched, but they were being stalked. Standing in the shadows of the woods behind the healthy pines were 2 individuals who were designated lookouts for the Southern Cartel. The Southern Boys was headed by 2 brothers named Tony and Brian. They were farm-raised down in the rural area of Marion County. When the blackout hit, the brothers were together in the fields plowing up dirt. They had 2 rather large houses put on the land their father left them. And just like every other American, the brothers were caught off guard by the sudden lack of electricity. Bringing all their friends, their wives' friends, kids' friends, and family members to the 50-acre ranch, Tony and Brian established the group in order to protect the local people from robbers, killers, rapists, and anyone trying to do harm in a time of need. Over a month's period of time, hundreds of people came to the ranch in search of refuge, but few remained. There are people of all nationalities on the property, but only the ones that came in peace. The many who brought violence to the ranch were killed or made to leave and never return. Rallo had no idea he and his people were in the middle of the Southern Boys' property and territory. Kyle stood outside the bus holding his handgun as Rallo opened the hood to let the bus engine cool off. Yo, Rallo, man, did you hear that? Kyle asked. Yeah, I heard it, but I can't see a thing out here, man. Taking aim through a night vision scope on his bow and arrow, one of the lookout guards named Harry had the driver of the bus in his sights. Harry was with Jasper, a local who found refuge on the Southern Boys' property a few days after the blackout struck. Moving in closer to get a better view, Harry was within 50 yards of the school bus. Jasper was approaching from the opposite side with his Remington shotgun pointed straight ahead. Who's there? Kyle asked aloud into the darkness as he swung his handgun to aim position. Pointing his weapon into the shadows of the night, Kyle heard the whistle of the boarhead arrow as it launched in his direction. By the time he heard the sound, it was too late. The razor-sharp arrow had entered through his back and exited through his chest. It happened so fast, Kyle looked at Rallo in disbelief. Rallo, help me, man. What did I do wrong, Run? Kyle said, as he gasped for air and fell forward on his face. Running to Kyle's aid, Rallo saw he was dead. But before he could react or even get back up to his feet, Jasper and Harry had closed in, weapons drawn. Get off the bus and get on the ground, Harry yelled to the passengers. We came from D.C., man, to get away from this type of shit, Rallo yelled from the ground as he lay on his stomach. I'm calling the brothers up, Jasper said aloud. We are here in peace, man. Don't move, Fred. Listen to what they have to say, Rallo said as terror crackled in his voice. We have some trespassers on the property, Brian, Jasper said as he spoke through an old walkie-talkie. Bring them in, a strong male voice from the other end answered. Hearing what the man said frightened Fred as he listened from the ground. Harry demanded that they all get up and walk toward the wood line. The boys from D.C. didn't want to go into midst of the tall pines, being all they could hear were crickets chirping and a few owls up in the trees. But they followed Jasper through a path that led back to the ranch gates. When they approached the entrance, there were two guys standing guard who ultimately let them pass. There were lights along the poles that were on both sides of a concrete walkway. Rallo and Fred hadn't seen any form of electricity in over a month. The Southern Boys had solar-powered generators that powered the ranch. It was like Rallo had landed on another planet. The ranch was like its own city. There were tents and small wooden barns scattered across the property. Each tent or barn represented someone's place of residence. As they approached the front porch of an extravagant 2-story brick house, the older brother Brian stepped out of the door. So you Northerners came to take over our land, but you were surprised to see us waiting for you, Brian said to Rallo. Nah, man, we came south to find peace and a better life. We didn't come to take over anything. We were actually headed to Horry County when our bus broke down, Rallo explained. Why did your friend point his weapon at my men back at the highway? Brian asked as he stood eye to eye with Rallo. He didn't point his weapon at your men. We couldn't see anything out there because it was so dark. We heard something in the woods, so we had our weapons for protection when your guy killed my friend. Well, if you want to stay here, you must carry your weight and prove your loyalty, Brian insisted. Having Harry and Jasper to show the DC crew around the estate, Brian went back inside the house with his family. Walking about 100 yards from the main area, Jasper showed Rallo and the boys the tents they would be sleeping in for the night. Harry showed them where the underground water pump was located before getting the hickory wood burning on a larger cooker grill so they could cook something to eat. For the first time in weeks, Rallo felt a sense of peace deep inside. Although it was hard times, the southern hospitality that was shown towards them lifted the crew's spirits. Agreeing to go get Kyle's body and give him a proper burial in the morning. Jasper and Harry apologized for the mishap or miscommunication. Before going back to the highway where they left Kyle, Jasper had one of the guys on the ranch bring the DC boys slaughtered, cleaned, and fully dressed a small goat to lay on the fire. By the time they returned with Kyle's body, the aroma could be smelled all over the ranch. Seeing Jasper and Harry coming out of the shadows towards the campfire, Rallo began to realize DC may be a thing of the past, when suddenly the sound of gunshots rang on the northern end of their territory. Rallo looked at Jasper as he attempted to radio into someone, but he received no feedback. Telling Rallo and Fred to come with them, leaving the rest of the crew at the grill, Jasper and Harry went to the stable, bringing out 2 horses. Loading the saddles on stallions, they passed Rallo and Fred, their weapons back. Getting on the horses and helping the DC boys up to ride on the back, Harry and Jasper took off into the night, telling them to hold on to their waists. The shots had drawn the attention of all the residents on the ranch. People were coming out of their tents and sheds to see what was going on. Once the boys reached the wood line, they got off the horses and tied them to a couple of trees. Telling Rallo and Fred to listen carefully as they walked through the forest, Jasper cautiously made his way to the area where the gunshots came. And after walking 2 miles through the creepy jungle, the guys reached the scene of what looked to be a sexual assault/murder. A young black woman was lying on the ground with her clothes ripped off. Her body was lying in a puddle of blood, and when the guys got closer, they realized she had been shot in the head. As they checked the perimeter, Rallo aimed his gun forward, waiting to shoot anything that moved. The area seemed to be clear when Fred noticed someone coming up from behind Jasper out of the bushes. Unable to say anything as it happened so fast, Fred immediately aimed towards Jasper and fired his weapon multiple times. Jasper didn't know what was going on as he ducked to the side. He thought Fred was trying to shoot him until he saw the body fall to the ground behind him. It was a clean shot, missing Jasper, hitting a tall black guy with dreads in the shoulder twice. And when Rallo, Fred, Harry, and Jasper ran over to the wounded man with their guns pointed, he spoke out. "I'm one of the good guys, B. I need help, son. My shoulder is leaking." Hearing the man speak, Jasper knew he was from up north, and Rallo, being from DC, recognized the guy to have a New York accent. "We can't bring him back. He's no good for this area," Harry said. For the past month, everyone who came from up north brought trouble to the Southern boys' territory. Luckily, they let the DC boys stay because every resident on the property is from the South. The man begged for his life, but his cries were overshadowed by the sound of thunder as Rallo shot him in the throat. The man reaching for a pistol he had stashed in his pants is what made Rallo kill him. That was the second time one of the DC boys saved the Southern boys. When they got back to the ranch, Jasper and Harry explained to Tony and Brian how the DC boys saved them out in the forest. Their loyalty was rewarded with loyalty. They were free to roam the area as well. They had access to anything and everyone on the ranch except someone who was married. The next morning, when the DC boys were burying their boy Kyle, they were able to see the beauty of the property and what it offered. There were gorgeous, clean women of all nationalities. Rallo and the boys hadn't washed in over a month, so they weren't the best-smelling crew. The ranch had a working multi-unit shower set up in a big barn in the center of the land for the residents. Crops were growing in the fields as far as Rallo could see. The pastures were filled with cattle, while large hogs were in their pens. They even had an area where the wild hogs ran. It was like a paradise compared to the DC streets they left. Rallo and Fred both agreed that they weren't going back up north. All of the boys from the capital state ended up staying in South Carolina, starting their lives over from that point. Chapter 12. Georgia deep down in Macon. Georgia, things couldn't be going any better. There wasn't any electric power or clean running water. The city had fallen back into prehistoric times in a matter of 2 months. One thing the people of Georgia did have was transportation. Being the dunk ride or old school car bay popular in the state, more vehicles were traveling the highways. But on this day at noon, down on Clever Street, things were heating up. A 27-year-old black woman named Helen and her sisters Gina and Natalie were at their house located in the rural area when someone knocked on their door. Hearing and seeing all the violence and chaos throughout the city and neighboring towns, Helen was on point as she cautiously went to her front door. Alerted by the sudden guess, the sisters looked at each other while Helen peeped through her curtains to see who was on the porch. It was a rather short black guy standing on the steps and another waiting in a car in the driveway. "What do you want?" Helen yelled through the door. "It's me, Jay. I'm a friend of your husband," he responded. Helen's husband, Phil, was killed 3 weeks ago when he went to Atlanta to get his cousin. He left Helen and her sisters plenty of food, gallons of water. He looted from stores, hundreds of lighters, plenty of bags of charcoal, 2 handguns with plenty of ammunition, candles, and anything they needed to survive. Phil told Helen not to trust anyone if anything ever happened to him, and that was in the back of her head as she grabbed the doorknob to open the door. Then suddenly Natalie started screaming. "Oh shit, sis! He's coming!" she said at the top of her voice. Immediately running away from the door to her sister Natalie, Helen had her lie down on the couch. She was 9 months pregnant and a week past due. Her water had broken, and the big moment had arrived. Gina was freaking out as she knew neither of them had baby delivering experience. Taking Natalie's wet pants off, Helen tried calming her down by saying the hard part was over. Natalie was taking deep breaths as Helen instructed her to push. Screaming out all types of vulgar language, Natalie gave it all she had as the baby's head popped out, followed by the rest of his body and a heart-wrenching cry. Holding what seemed to be a healthy baby boy in her hands, Helen reached out to grab a dry towel that Gina handed her to wrap the baby in. Meanwhile, Jay was still knocking at the door. But he was knocking harder than before, being he could hear the yelling and commotion on the inside. Gina was scared to let him in, especially with them being in such a vulnerable state. "Hey, is everything all right in there?" Jay asked as he spoke through the door. Looking at Helen, who was holding the baby at the moment, Gina asked, "Should I let him in?" Passing her nephew to his mother, Helen grabbed the 10mm handgun off the kitchen table. Holding the gun behind her back as Gina opened up the door, Helen patiently waited to see if Jay was attempting to harm them. But to her surprise, he rushed to the aid of Natalie, claiming he was a traveling doctor before the blackout hit. Running back out to his car, Jay came back inside with a bag. It was his physician bag. He cared for Natalie the best he could, considering the situation. Seeing that her deceased husband's friend wasn't there to cause them any problems, Helen yelled outside for Jay's homeboy to come inside as well. When he entered her place, he introduced himself as Riddick. And although Helen was at peace with letting Jay inside, she wasn't comfortable with Riddick's presence. He had a crazy look on his face. He looked like he was up to something. So Helen kept her eyes on him closely, watching every move he made. All she could think about was what her husband told her. Don't trust anyone. Insisting that he would be leaving soon, Jay asked Helen if she needed a man's hand around the house, which she implied they would be fine. Riddick seems to be focused on something else. He was rather quiet, but Helen could tell he was casing the joint. His eyes wandered like a kid in a toy store. So Helen kept the pistol on her hip as she helped Natalie get as comfortable as possible with the newly born baby Ryan. After a couple of hours, Jay was heading to the front door to leave. Riddick followed behind when all of a sudden he snuffed Jay from the backside. Falling to the floor, knocked unconscious, Jay was helpless as Riddick turned to the ladies. Standing in front of Natalie as she held Ryan, 6'5" Riddick charged toward Gina, attempting to beat her up. When Helen pulled the 9mm from her waist, he froze up, standing in place. Motherfucker, If you want to live, you better clear your mind and get the hell out of here, she quickly said after registering a bullet in the chamber. Suddenly, all the commotion went silent. Riddick was looking at Helen eye to eye when she fired off one shot. Hitting him in the right shoulder, Helen continued to aim her weapon at Riddick. "Ah, fuck, bitch, you shot me," Riddick yelled as he charged Helen, unexpectedly knocking her down off her feet. "Leave my sister alone," Gina yelled as she jumped on Riddick's back. Choking him with all her strength, Gina was tossed to the floor as Riddick gained the upper hand. Natalie So was terrified as she didn't know what to do. "Leave us alone, please. Leave us alone," she screamed. Still knocked out on the floor, Jay was no help. Giving Helen just the second she needed to get a good grip back on her 9mm, she called out to Riddick before taking aim again. "I gave you a warning. Now you have to feel it, you punk bitch," she uttered under her breath as she squeezed the trigger repeatedly. This time, Helen hit Riddick 2 times, once in his chest and once in the stomach. But just like before, he charged in her direction. Helen stood her ground, firing at him until her gun was empty. Acting like a man high on PCP, Riddick continued to charge Helen, tackling her against the wall. Lying on her back, attempting to catch her breath, Helen looked up at Riddick as he tried to get to his feet. He had bullet holes in numerous areas of his body, but it didn't seem to faze him at all. Blood squirted out of the wounds as he made one last attempt to get on top of Helen. She was weak and had fought all she could fight. As Riddick stood over Helen, trying to pull her pants off, Natalie came from his blind side with an old baseball bat. She went Barry Bonds on his cranium, and when the bat made contact with his skull, the cracking noise was similar to the sound of a major league home run being hit. Riddick fell to the floor as his body began to twitch. That's when Natalie ran up closer and swung again, hitting him in the face. A mixture of teeth and blood flew everywhere. "You motherfucker," Natalie repeated as she swung over and over, crushing Riddick's skull on one side. At that moment, Jay began to wake up on the floor. He had no idea what had just transpired. And by the time he made it to his feet, he saw his boy Riddick lying in a puddle of blood. "Some help having a man around the house was," Helen joked as she tried to bring some light to a dark situation. Chapter 13. Mexico City, Mexico. Thousands of miles away from his hometown in Compton, California, Gene Harshaw was in one of the largest cities on the planet, Mexico City. When the blackout first hit, and word spread that Mexico had electricity, Gene and a few of his friends loaded up in an old-school Oldsmobile heading south to Texas. By the time they made it to Chihuahua, Mexico, the desert heat had killed 2 of his friends, making it a 3-man crew. Once they were in Mexico, it wasn't hard for them to get a car, and being millions of people who stayed along the border, attempting to enter Mexico at the same time, the neighboring Mexican cities were erupting in chaos. Hungry and starved Americans were looting and robbing stores. The Juarez and Chihuahua crime rate spiked 10 times higher than normal. Some of the U.S. citizens were welcomed in by Mexican families, while some were killed before they could ask for help. The Mexican government was under serious pressure to protect its people from the crazed and desperate gringos. Gene had managed to hook up with a gorgeous young lady from Mexico City the first day he arrived. Her name was Marisol Hernandez, and she was the cousin of a hitman who worked for the Juarez cartel, so John was connected with those guys as well. Although the Juarez and Sinaloa cartel were battling over turf when the blackout hit America and the people came south, it made the war even more difficult. Thousands of people died in the desert and by Mexican residents protecting their land. But thousands made it through as well. So the streets that were normally filled with Spanish-speaking folks were flooded with people who couldn't understand Spanish at all. Hundreds of unfamiliar faces made ducking and dodging a hitman hard. The Americans were damn near taking over the territory, They had guns and the will to do any and everything to survive. The Mexican gangsters and cartel leaders weren't used to seeing the gringos so aggressive. It was 2 months since the blackout began, and the Americans had so much control in Mexico City that they nicknamed some of the hoods they were in names like New Chicago, Lil Texas, the Dade Boys, Lil Bama, and Spanish Atlanta. On the other hand, Jean was chilling with Marisol, having drinks, when she received a call from her cousin, the cartel hitman. He was in need of a few of Jean's friends to kill a guy that violated their crew. Marisol really too didn't want Yean involved in illegal activities, insisting they could live a good life together without the madness. Marisol cousin Goon wanted Jean to meet him at a local pool hall on the west side of the city. She made Jean promise that he wouldn't get involved with that particular mission before he left. As he backed out of her yard heading downtown, Marisol stared out of the window at her newly found love, knowing he was dealing with a dangerous group of individuals. Meanwhile, in the car, Jean was making sure his partners Rico and G-Love were ready to get busy. Supposedly, Goon was going to take Rico and G-Love by the house where a guy named Louis lived. All they had to do is kick the door down and kill everyone in the house. Rico was ready to murder everything moving after Goon implied he was giving them 5 kilos of cocaine to complete the mission. And when they arrived at the pool hall, Goon was waiting inside of his F-250 King Cab pickup truck. G-Love and Rico hopped out of the vehicle with Jean and got in the truck with Goon. He told Jean to go back to his cousin Marisol and he would drop the boys off when they're done. What was supposedly an easy task became complicated when Rico peeped through the window of their target's house and saw 2 dudes in their 20s sitting at the table playing dominoes. The target was supposed to be home alone with his wife, but Rico had already seen 2 people, and neither was Louis. And it didn't make it any better that there was a vicious pit bull barking in the backyard. It was too late to turn back. Rico ran on the porch from the side of the house and kicked the door as hard as he could without losing his balance. G-Love went through the door first, gripping the mini assault rifle Goon gave him tightly. As the door crashed in, the guys at the table reached for their guns. But G-Love had the drop on them being he came through the door so quickly. Speaking in Spanish, one of the guys attempted to fire a shot at G. Love, but was hit in the face with a slug from G's rifle. The other guy ducked behind the sofa as G-Love continued to bust AK-47 rounds in his direction. At the very moment, Rico came into the living room. He saw the guy trying to hide behind the chair and returned fire when he aimed with his 12-gauge. Rico pulled the trigger, knocking the man away from the chair, rolling across the floor. The blast from the shotgun was so loud, they didn't know someone was shooting at them from the hallway. "You fucking gringos fuck with the wrong Mexicans today," the man said as he fired an automatic MAC-10 at Rico and Jean. Ducking down as if they could see the bullets, Rico hid behind the bar, while Jean got behind the refrigerator. They had another man to kill, and he wasn't even the target. As the Mac sprayed bullets in their direction, G-Love was distracted when he saw someone come into the back door. It was Louis, but he came in the house shooting a 500 Raging Bull. Rico and G-Love was trapped in the middle. Instead of being the hunters, they were now the hunted. "Damn, bro, I got hit," G-Love yelled as he fell to the floor. Hit in the lower shoulder, G couldn't use his right arm at all. Adrenaline pumped through his body as he couldn't die in some Mexican house far from America. Rico fired at the man in the hallway with the MAC-10, but was shot in the back of his head by a so powerful 500 mag. His cranium exploded, sending fecal matter and skull fragments everywhere. Seeing his boy's head pop like a balloon, G-Love went into shock as Louis aimed his 500 Raging Bull at him. Instead of shooting him right there, they got all the info they could get from G before putting him in the car and driving away. G-Love felt like he had no choice but to tell who sent him. And when they arrived at Marisol's house, she and Jean had no idea what was about to take place. Goon was waiting for the call from Rico. But Rico was dead. So goons sat patiently in the parking lot of a drugstore, waiting for something that wasn't about to happen. He didn't know Louis had G-Love in the back seat with a gun to his head. Back at Marisol's house, Louis blew the horn repeatedly until someone came to the door. It was Marisol, but she was confused because she didn't recognize the car. Getting out of the back seat with his gun to G-Love, Louis yelled out to her, "You sent him for me. Well, here he goes," before blowing Jesus' brains all in the front yard. Marisol screamed as she tried to run back inside the house. Hearing the gunshot, Jean ran to the door as Marisol knocked him down coming inside. Knowing he had to move quickly, Louis ran up the steps into the doorway of the house where Jean and Marisol was attempting to get up. Unable to reach the gun that he dropped as he bumped into his girl, Jean pleaded with Louis, claiming he neither Marisol had anything to do with this. But Louis wasn't hearing anything Jean was saying as he pointed the large handgun at his Mexican love. Louis looked deep into Jean's eyes before pulling the trigger. "No!" Jean yelled as Marisol's body hit the floor once again. While on his knees, Jean immediately grabbed her up off the floor in his arms. Holding her tightly, he looked up at Louis, who was looking down the sights of his gun, and lowered his head. Jean closed his eyes, squeezing Marisol's bloody body with love in his heart tighter than ever. He waited for the bang, but when he looked up again, Louis was gone. Still on his knees, Jean rocked back and forth as he cried out, holding his girl in his arms. Then suddenly Marisol began to cough. She was just knocked unconscious from the impact of the bullet grazing her head. Seeing his love was still alive, Jean did something he never did before in his life. He thanked the great Lord repeatedly, loud enough for the world to hear. Chapter 14. California. With no running water throughout the entire state, the Sunshine State of California was a deathbed. The small farmers couldn't survive as they did in the South. The soil was much drier. The neighbors weren't as friendly with each other at a time when they should have been teaming together. From Hollywood to Beverly Hills, people looted all the stores, movie studios, restaurants, and mansions. The flashy cities were ghost towns laced with dead and decaying bodies. Airborne viruses spread quickly through the infestation of diseased people who died on the side of the road, in the buildings that burned down, in the rivers, and in local water streams. People prayed vigorously for rain that never came. The state was suffering from a drought well before the blackout hit. But with no working air conditioners, running water, and a jammed-up sewer system, the state was turning into a baked clay pot. Even the big city of Los Angeles was under severe distress. Gangs ran everything from Vermont Avenue to Skid Row. The presence of a real piece of beef or pork was as scarce as the water they waited for to fall from the sky daily. Rather than starve their families out, some people resorted to eating cats and dogs. People were doing things they never imagined they would be doing in a million years. There wasn't a police officer in sight. And once the Californians got the word that the country had been attacked by North Korea, the local gangs waged war against any Korean or Asian person they saw. No one cared that they were U.S. citizens just like them. If they had slanted Asian eyes, they weren't safe. But on the other hand, nobody in the state was safe. Not even the toughest man could walk around without looking over his shoulder. South Central and Watts were killing fields. Places that you would normally reeked the smell of barbecue cooking on the grill were clouded with gun smoke. Empty bullet shells were littered throughout the streets. Kids as young as 10 years old were forced to go out with pistols and find food for the family. The weak, elderly, and women were being hunted like a lion's prey in an African bush. Most Mexicans left California weeks after the blackout started, heading down to Mexico. San Diego was damn near empty. It was so close to Mexico that American citizens could see lights on at the Mexican houses on the other side of the border. The Mexican city of Hermosillo, which was the capital of the state. Sonora was bombarded by thousands of pissed-off and desperate Americans. They took the city over. Mexican Americans, illegal immigrants who stayed in California, blacks and whites together, made Hermosillo as the new California. With plenty of food and clean water, people began to live life as normally as they did back home. Some even learned to speak Spanish, as well as teach some Spanish folks English. It was a new world, but it wasn't half bad, considering what they left behind.